Welcome everybody. This is the second half of the plenary presentation ending the Ukraine war by Brian D'Agostino and Ken Rasmussen. In the second hour, we'll continue with Ken's presentation, followed by Brian's response, and then a brief response, from me as we transition into general discussion. So anyway, Ken Rasmussen, Dr. Ken Rasmussen is an historian and psychoanalytical psychotherapist who teaches at Santa Monica College and has a private practice in Santa Monica. His research interests include the psychohistory of political ideologies, left and right, and the psychological dimension of philosophy and the philosophy as therapy. So, Ken, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Now, I based my remarks on Brian's article, but what he said today fits very nicely to extrapolate on that, and especially the themes that I think warrant our discussion. So, in this article, Brian chooses to critique arguments by several thinkers who argue that Russia is militaristic and that NATO expansion was not an aggressive threat to Russian national security. He then marshals statistics showing U.S. expenditures on weaponry are gigantically much more than those of Russia to prove that Putin's Russia is not militaristic or a true threat. Or if they are, the West is greatly more, especially in terms of its military spending. So Brian concludes that the factual causal chain of events shows that the most important cause of the war was NATO expansion, that the American NATO response to Putin's invasion of providing strong but limited military assistance was in effect a combination of a policy of aggressiveness toward Russia and Putin, in which Putin's overtures for peace were met with sabotage and resistance. He goes so far as to say, quote, the United States pursued a hawkish foreign policy under Barack Obama that included support for an anti-Russian coup in Kiev of 2014, which resulted or provoked Putin's conquest of Crimea in 2014. In a concluding section, Brian concludes the evidence shows that Washington's real intentions in its support for Ukraine was, quote, precisely to entrap Russia into a war that would be its own undoing, and ultimately to regime change that would open Russia up to American capitalistic investment and control. Now, this seems to me to be a seriously distorted interpretation of the historical record. What we need to do is have a large and more historical perspective, going beyond what's recently happened and the chronology of everything and selected events shorn of context. As has been pointed out in our discussion already, Russia and Ukraine have a long history together, and for a very long time they were deeply intertwined. And it's quite important to realize also that Russia under Tsardom, going back centuries, was an imperial empire, as Peter pointed out, built over centuries with major annexations and additions in the 19th century, including, especially Chechnya. And you have, of course, Crimea, as Peter mentioned, in the 18th with Catherine the Great. Now, in 1918, the Tsarist regime collapsed, and the Bolsheviks took over. And they declared their policy to be a union of socialist republics freed of oppressive domination. Under Lenin, but especially Stalin, this gradually proved to be more rhetoric than reality. This would be exactly what Brian correctly identifies as ideology when it masks the power grab of an elite. In this case, the power grab of a red elite, indistinguishable in essence from being a new capitalist class, which one could best call, I think, state capitalism, With the historical collapse of the Stalinist communist empire, the end of the 1980s, Eastern European nations crushed for decades, both under World War II Stalin and under Stalin's extension of the Bolshevik version of empire under Lenin, after 40 some years, finally emerged to seek independence as well as construct a semblance of democracy. It is this struggle for national independence and to democratize, combined with Putin and Russia's resistance to accepting this, that is the overall historical context for the conflict and war today. Now, I want to quote from my psychohistorical colleague, Ken Fuchsman, who's written a very good essay on this topic. And he says this, in the 1990s, the former Soviet republics had to decide whether to remain part of Russia or become their own country. In a 1991 plebiscite, 90% of Ukrainians voted in favor of their country being an independent nation. The popularity of Ukrainian independence was a blow to Russian nationalists. According to the Council of Foreign Relations, Jonathan Masters, spokesman, next to Russia, Ukraine was the second most populous and powerful of the 15 Soviet republics, home to so much of the Union's agricultural production, defense industries, and military, including the Black Sea Fleet, and a big part of the nuclear arsenal. Ukraine was so vital to the Soviet Union that its decision to sever ties in 1991, one could say, was a coup de grace. And Ken phrased it as for the alien superpower. What I would modify that and say a coup de grace for those within Russia who want to who wanted to keep Russia as a superpower and follow through on the imperial vision of Russian identity. The new Ukrainian Republic suddenly became the country with the third most nuclear weapons of the planet, which they then negotiated with Russia to give up in return for guarantees of not being invaded. About 1/3 of Russia's total nuclear arsenal was housed in Ukrainian territory. So Russia handed over those weapons for an agreement that Russia would respect Ukraine's sovereignty. There were two such similar arrangements between Russia and Ukraine. The first in 1994, known as the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, the US, and the United Kingdom pledged to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. In 1997, there was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership between Ukraine and the Russian Federation that recognized the inviolability of present borders, the respect for each nation's territorial integrity, and pledged not to invade each other. These documents are indications of how the new Russia was, for a time, willing to cooperate and ensure the sovereignty of the newly freed satellite nations. So this brings us to the question of why this came to an end. Why is it that Russia and the West couldn't have continued on a harmonious path? And by the way, we're talking about Ukraine as part of Russia. Crimea, although it was the next in the 18th century, was given over, was transferred in sovereignty in 1954, and for then 60 years was part of Ukraine. So there was this relative honeymoon of Russia evolving in harmony with the West and allowing freedom to the previously subjugated Slavic nations. But this was not to last. There was even talk of Russia joining NATO and, more importantly, the European Union. Several things got in the way. One was the Russian war on Chechnya, 1992 to 94, which was an attempt by Putin to rein in a province that was seeking to be too independent from Russia and to actually be independent. And so this was related to the ascension to power of Vladimir Putin. He took over the leadership of the new democratic Russia, 1999-2000, was elected president as a essentially a pragmatic realist, somewhat liberal, clearly more competent and steady than Yeltsin, and widely supported by the Russian population as a strong leader, the one that Russia desperately needed to bring stability and end the chaos. You see the war on Georgia in 2008 as an attempt by Russia, or under Putin's leadership, to curtail, or actually stop Georgia from halting the independence of some of the provinces that Russia had been supporting. So that war kind of broke out, and it was settled, but it was, I think, an indication of this trajectory of Putin's foreign policy leadership. So let's look at who Putin was. At first, he was an assistant to Yeltsin, but his origins were as a KGB officer stationed in the DDR, who in hindsight now we can realize clearly used rhetoric and ideology to gain more and more power. And this is, of course, completely in tune with what Brian says politicians do. But it's also at this time, and this was this was a statement, not necessarily a major speech, he wrote, the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, unquote. Note that Putin's not mentioning the Holocaust nor the loss of 30 million Russians to the Nazi invasion, but the loss of an empire as being the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. So it was Putin who balked especially at the growing independence of Ukraine, which evolved over decades, particularly its economic drift to join the European Union. Fuchsman points out that it was more the fact that Ukraine was about to join the EU than the prospect of NATO membership, which actually was not imminent, that motivated Putin to intervene in Ukrainian politics at this time, around 2014. Again, quoting Fuchsman, in 2014, in November, the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and Vladimir Putin met secretly with no announcement or publicity. They agreed that Ukraine would suspend its EU application and instead sign an agreement with Russia. According to an aide to the Lithuanian president, Yanukovych had called her before to announce that he was going to ditch the EU pact. And he said that this was due to pressure from Moscow that was irresistible. She said that Putin threatened Ukraine with restricted imports of its goods to Russia, particularly from companies in eastern Ukraine, which happened to encompass the greater share of its industry and employed hundreds of thousands of people. So in 2014, the president of Ukraine abruptly changed course and canceled Ukraine's application to join the EU. In response to what they believed was Yanukovych's capitulation to Putin's pressure, tens of thousands of liberal Western-oriented Ukrainians protested in the streets. Some were shot, and in the uproar, Yanukovych fled. This is called the Maiden Revolution for the square in which the bloodshed took place. Brian calls it a coup and embraces Putin's allegation that it was essentially CIA instigated. He does say supported. Brian endorses the scholarship of one writer who argues that an important factor was going on here was that neo-Nazism had grown to be a powerful force in Ukraine. I think the reality is that although it existed, it never had any kind of dominance in any vote. Its political party got no more than 2 to 3%. We're talking about the Azov battalion, and that is an issue. It did have a lot of neo-Nazi people and sentiment, but journalists who've talked to people on the ground in Ukraine, 2 people in the Azov battalion say they do not detect that this mentality of neo-Nazism or ultra extreme nationalism, although it's definitely extreme nationalism, is prevalent. So time doesn't permit really going into this very complicated historical diplomatic record, but in sum, Putin for at least a decade has resolved and acted to stop the evolution of Ukraine to attain substantive independence from the Russian Federation. February 24, 2022 was the desperate culmination of this effort. Putin alleges, which is, I believe, factually false, that the Russian speakers were, and this is still claimed, the victims of genocide. And I'm sure many of you, if you've been watching the news, are hearing somebody else accusing a beleaguered minority of suffering genocide. I'm speaking about South Africa. There is no evidence that the Afrikaners are experiencing genocide, although there's been a lot of violence, and it's a very serious problem. But by exaggerating and saying that it's genocide, it's the same kind of rhetoric and ideological manipulation that Putin and the Russian nationalist cause employs to justify their invasion. So what this means is, and what I'd like to come back to is, or at least to focus, is the reality of ideology. What is ideology as a concept? What is its role in general in history and in bringing about the Russia-Ukraine war? Now, Marx, interestingly, used the word as a pejorative. You could say the whole idea of calling things an ideology stems from Marx's like for doing so. It's a pejorative word, ideology, something negative in this original usage. It was coined actually originally in the aftermath of the French Revolution to castigate the philosophes and their would-be successors in the Napoleonic era. And the concept was, on the part of the right, that these reformers were ideologues whose rhetoric was dreamy fantasy that simply would cause trouble. So interestingly enough, Marx adopted this negative meaning of the word to apply to bourgeois intellectuals who opposed his ideas, who he believed were simply providing rationalizations for the rich and the powerful. But thinkers after Marx, both liberal and socialist, improved on his deterministic reductionism to illuminate how ideology can be, even if it's sometimes a hermeneutic of suspicion. I can explain that, something bigger or something more. Now, time doesn't permit a full analysis of ideology, but I recommend to you, if you're interested in the subject, to read Karl Mannheim on ideology, ideology and utopia, talking about how there are different ideologies, and some want to go backwards and some want to go forwards into utopia. Antonio Gramsci was also an important Marxist thinker who argued that overcoming capitalism meant overcoming bourgeois cultural hegemony. And therefore, the cultural domain is central to the class struggle, as well as the factories and labor. Jürgen Habermas of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory also utilized what is known as hermeneutics, the art of interpretation of culture, into his analysis of how to achieve radical change. So you also see an approach to culture in Horkheimer and Adorno when they talk about the culture industry and how it can function, more or less along the lines of Marx's original vision, however. Now, I will end with some observations about how ideology can be seen as two-sided rather than as a mask or a subterfuge. The negative use of ideology is all too common, and it is important. And this is when words and rhetoric are used to obfuscate, to blur the line between fact and fiction, divide and conquer, or simply dominate. We're seeing this on a daily basis going on in the United States. This is where ideology becomes propaganda, and one could say gaslighting writ large, a narcissistic process. And this is something that's rife on the far right, this kind of ideology. A favorite verbal tactic is gross exaggeration. Trump seldom speaks without doing this, taking something that has a grain of truth and then inflating it wildly, exaggerating it, what is really exaggerating it into what is a caricature of reality. More undocumented immigrants have committed crimes and are coming into our country than is desirable. This becomes, in Trump's toxic ideology, an assertion that these people are rapists and criminals. And since they have arrived in large numbers, it's an invasion. This is the radical right engaging in what Ludwig Wittgenstein called the bewitchment of language. The radical left sometimes does this as well. Exaggeration for effect throws truth overboard. So that's just a whole other theme, and not necessarily directly related to our subject, but it has to do with the uses and abuses of ideology. So two ideological terms that come up that are central to our discussion to look at, as I mentioned, are militarism and liberal democracy, a number of others. Both are obviously useful terms, but they also are laden with meaning. Don't always mean one thing, and they mean different things to different people. And unless they are used with accuracy and with an awareness of historical change and specificity, they get in the way rather than illuminate. So militarism, take that word, historically is not simply a nation with a large military and a large military budget. It means rather, it's an ism, so it's the ideology in which military values and the military ethos, an attitude where negotiated settlements to conflict are unimportant and supplanted by military solutions, is dominant. 18th and 19th century Prussia, for example, about whom I believe it was Voltaire said, some nations have a military. In Prussia, a military has a nation. You could also look at Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld in 2003 in league with neocon ideologists, persuading Bush to go in the direction of militarism with the Iraq War of 2003. And more recently, Netanyahu, I think, highly qualifies for the term militarism, an attempt to solve the Israel-Arab-Palestinian conflict using the military rather than any negotiation of substance.
So Ken,
yes.
If you
could we
wrap
done?
up.
20 minutes
already? If you could wrap up.
Okay, so I'll just end with one observation, just flowing from this. I think, therefore, that when Brian uses the term militarism, it's not helpful then to imply that U.S. and NATO militarism is equivalent to Putin and Russia's militarism these days. It's comparable, but it is qualitatively different, and I think that's what we need to discuss. If you want to put that into the discussion.
Thank you, Ken.